All right, greetings, fellow humans. Today on Doing the Thing with your host, myself, Scott Boersma, is Maddie. She and I worked together this past spring and on a trip that was really quite fun and awesome. It was her birthday on that trip, and so she had a group of students sing to her, and they're a Waldorf school, so they didn't just sing the normal happy birthday song, and they sang their version of it. Then we were going to have a cake for her that evening. However, unfortunately, the weather then decided otherwise, and the cake kind of just like took second to being like, oh, we're all panicking because it's raining in the desert, and that's not supposed to happen. And then we had a Deer Hill hat came in on our resupply that we then presented to her on the next night at service. And then the next night, we then had a little dance party because one of our co-instructors brought a little disco ball that plugged into her phone, and it was hilarious because her phone had to be on and unlocked for it to work, and so it would be going off, and then we would all be like doing our little car dance, and then it would shut off, and we'd be like, what? As we were getting to the end of this trip and losing our minds a little bit. Maddie is originally from Colorado. She has been doing outdoor things for quite some time. She was the weirdo who went to the Boundary Waters up in northern Minnesota, because why does the people from Colorado do that? That's what everybody thinks. Then eventually made her way back to Deer Hill, where we worked our first trip this past spring together. This is Maddie.
Hi, everyone. That was certainly one of the quirkiest ways to celebrate my birthday. That was my first ever trail birthday as well. So yeah, to get celebrated 3 different times for various occasions was pretty unique.
How did you get into being like an outdoor educator? From my experience, it's always the people who are from Colorado working as an outdoor educator or guide in Colorado is few and far between, because these people have gotten their fill of outdoor experiences and no personal trips, and like the freedom that brings versus I've never seen a 14er in my life, so I'm going to go out and work this job because I like working with kids and I want to be outside.
Yeah, I mean, that's such a good question. I grew up in Idaho Springs, which is pretty close to the Front Range of Colorado, and just was really steeped in doing outdoorsy things growing up as a kid. You know, we'd take school field trips to local state parks, and my PE teacher was a raft guide at one of the local places in Idaho Springs. And so I feel like I just kind of grew up in this space of like tourism and recreation. But it wasn't until in, I believe, 8th grade, I took a rafting trip down Desolation Canyon with who at the time had been a math teacher at my middle school, but who started an organization called Goals, Get Outside and Learn Something. He took our class on a trip down Deso Gray, and it just was one of those experiences that changed my life, where it was like, whoa, this is so cool, this is so awesome. We worked with the guides for quite a number of things. You know, I had the chance to row one of the rafts a little bit, not anything dangerous or hard, but, you know, just to get the chance to get in the oars and kind of see how that felt was really life-changing. But that trip ended, and I realized a really critical thing. I really dislike sand. And so that prompted me to take a Boundary Waters in Quetico trip the next summer. I wanted to do more stuff, you know, water sports related, but just really wanted to go somewhere where it wasn't hot and sandy. So I traded in hot and sand for mosquitoes and lakes, and just had probably one of the most phenomenal 10-day trips of my life. We were in a pretty remote area of the Quetico, which is just north of the Boundary Waters in northern Minnesota. And we did about a 70-mile trip in 7 days, you know, up through Kanippie, Cashapeewee, kind of some of those lakes. Maybe you're not familiar. I think I showed you them, Scott, on a map, but just a really phenomenal experience, and, you know, learned a lot about myself and a lot about guiding and leadership and being out there. And this program that I went through called the Northern Lakes Girl Scout Canoe Base asked if I wanted to be a guide in training the next season. And I pretty quickly was like, yes, I want to be a guide in training. This sounds sick. You know, I grew up Girl Scouting. I always kind of figured I would do some sort of Girl Scout camp program. I was really convinced I would be a horse wrangler for one of the camps in Colorado, but it closed down. So yeah, my path kind of veered off into water sports and canoeing. Gosh, 2016, 2015, I was a guide in training for a season. I still think probably one of the happiest moments I've ever had in my whole life was the very first trip I was a guide in training. You know, we launch our canoes, we're getting out onto the lake. And I just like had this overwhelming feeling of like, yeah, this is it. Just the sheer joy of being back in the stern and being with kids and like getting this opportunity to learn how to guide was just so phenomenal to little 16-year-old me at the time. I was a guide in training for 2 years and then continued on as a guide for the Girl Scout base in northern Minnesota after that. So my story, Boundary Waters wise, is pretty similar to a lot of people's who get involved in the Boundary Waters or the Quetico. They like go on a trip, it changes their life, they become a guide in training, and then they become a guide. It's really funny. It's this very clear pipeline for a lot of people. But yeah, that's kind of my origin and how I got into it. My sheer distaste of sand, honestly, is what brought me to northern Minnesota.
And like for those people who don't know, Deso Gray is a section of the Green River in Utah, and it is desert there. So it is every beach can be, some beaches are really nice and sandy, and some beaches are less nice and still sandy. But there's a lot of sand.
Yeah,
a lot of sediment in that water too.
So much sand. It's just everywhere.
You have to just accept the sand because there is no escaping it.
Well, that's what I learned this summer. I definitely handled the sand way better than I did as a 14-year-old. You know, it still gets everywhere.
So how did you find your way out back to the southwest of Colorado?
You know, I had been working in northern Minnesota for a while. I went from guiding canoe trips professionally for an outfitter up there, then ended up working actually for a nonprofit for a couple years called Save the Boundary Waters, and loved the work, but just got really burnt out from like, telling people how amazing being outside is, and then never really having enough time or space to like, go engage in those activities myself. So I left Minnesota, went on a little bit of a journey, ended up at a wilderness EMT course through Knowles, which is where I met another Deer Hill instructor, Kayla, and they were really psyched. They were like, you should totally apply for Deer Hill if you want to learn to raft. I find that I'm not really like an adrenaline seeker, and so paddle guiding didn't sound awesome, but like gentle little trips on the San Juan, like a couple of little rapids, sounded kind of like my ideal. So that's how I applied and then got accepted and ended up getting in to a couple of trips for this last summer.
You want to share the story of that first trip and how much you've heard it already?
So I guess Scott and I's first trip, you know, I kind of knew who Scott was beforehand because I also had been living with Kayla, this person who introduced me to Deer Hill. And they didn't share anything, like any stories, but it was like, oh yeah, you'll meet Scott. I knew a little bit about you. So we're out on this trip and Scott, you're like telling a story about this other instructor. And very quickly I was like, ooh, this other instructor is someone who I know. It is the reason why I'm here. But Scott, you did it so professionally. Like you weren't using names. You weren't like calling anyone out. It was just very like facts statement period. But like, you know, we did, God, what was that? Like a 12-day program, 14-day program.
Yeah, we did. It was like we were contracted for probably 14.
Yeah.
14
And then
days.
the two of us went to a Swiftwater course. And so just like this, the whole 14 days, I was like, oh my God, I feel so bad that I have this information. I know this story. I kind of know what's going on, but Scott is none the wiser. So yeah, the beginning of the Swiftwater course, I came clean and just kind of was like, hey, this person you've talked about numerous times, like I live with them. They're the reason I'm here. I can't handle holding that secret anymore. I felt so bad. I still feel kind of bad.
I'm pretty sure that is one of the top like 1% of times that I feel like I've been gotten so well on anything. Especially because did Kayla tell you about the story of like the losing boats as well? That was
very vaguely. They mentioned it, and it was more like I didn't have the tools necessary to ensure that the boats were locked in, and you know, it was told very much from their perspective and not from like Scott and I really messed up kind of thing.
And then there's me. He's like, yep, totally F that up. Like, that'll be a story for another time on the podcast. Anyway,
Yes.
what has like been something that you've like really taken away from like being the guide, being the instructor?
Oh man, I think like through so much of this, like when you're young, you're kind of like, yeah, I'm the bestest, I'm on top of it, I know everything. The program I worked for when I first started out guiding was, really in the habit of like, we're pushing, we're doing big routes, we're seeing it all, we're doing it all. And I think as I've gained more skills, gained more experience, worked for more programs, I think one of the best things I've ever learned is that like a gentle trip can actually be like really good for some participants. Because some of them, like they're stepping so far out of their normal world, just asking them to be there is massive for them. And now if you're asking them to be there and to like paddle 100 miles and to like do all this hard stuff constantly, like, for some kids, like they can handle it and they're resilient and like that's what they want. And for me as an instructor, like learning how to cater trips to people who are not searching for that has been like so humbling and so important to meet the students where they're at and to like create a meaningful experience where they're hopefully having more type 1 fun than type 2 fun. Because some of those more sendy, pushy trips end up a lot of times being type 2 because you're just like, well, this sucks. Gotta keep going. Every student is different and, different kids get different experiences. I know that seems so basic, but, until I really started getting more experience with more students from different backgrounds, like that became more evident. Working with kids who are kind of my same type, it's easy because it's like, okay, this is what I want to do, so you want to do it too. And once I started working with kids who were not that same type, that was really eye-opening and I think really helped develop me more and my guiding skills and my ability to like meet kids where they're at. Because tents are scary. Like that's hard. Camping is hard, like it's so hard.
You talked about meeting people where they were at, and at what point did that hit you?
I think it was I was actually a volunteer guide with Big City Mountaineers. We had a group come up from Miami and, we were on Lake 3 for those Boundary Waters aficionados out there, which is not very far into the wilderness. It was one of those lakes where previously it was like, great, by Lake 3, we're eating lunch on Lake 3, and then we're pushing farther. Lake 3 in my mind was pretty synonymous with like first day, you never stay there. On this trip, it was really humbling and fun to work with a guy who had been working with students from other backgrounds, where it was like, no, this is as far as they want to go. This is as far as we're going, period. And, it just was such a life-changing moment of like, okay, yeah, you're right. Like these students don't seem like they want to go any farther. Let's just hang out. And that was only a couple of years ago, like 2022. Yeah, I became a base camper after that. That is absolutely was like, yeah, we can chill. What the hell am I doing? We're just gonna hang out. And then every trip has always been awesome.
Did you ever teach lessons in the Boundary Waters stuff, or was it more just like we're out here doing the thing, so to speak?
It kind of depended. I feel like I was definitely one to intertwine lessons and culture and history, especially as I got older and especially after I started working for Save the Boundary Waters. Like I really wanted to incorporate more than just like, look at that birch, isn't it nice? Because it's a really culturally rich and historically rich area. There's a lot that has happened in there for millennia. So I would often try to include lessons and things, but none of it was ever like an official thing through the programs I worked for. I just kind of cobbled stuff together because I thought it was interesting.
That's cool. Would you care to share the relationship with a canoe?
Yeah, with canoeing, there's a lot of, I find, reciprocity that goes into it, because the canoe carries you through the water. Of course, you have to paddle it and help the canoe move forward. But, once you run out of water, i.e. you have to do a portage from one lake to the next lake, you have to carry your canoe. And in many ways, I feel like canoes and boats like become a part of the trip because they're so integral to what you have to do. And you do have to share a lot of love with them to like carry them across the portage and make sure you're not whacking it on the ground because you definitely don't want to break your canoe. When you work for a program too that just has so many limited resources, like taking care of the hard goods like the canoes is just like so important. And so I feel like I always just kind of view the canoes as another participant or guide on our trips because they're there with us, they carry us, they keep our stuff dry, like we'll store stuff under the canoes at night. I would make canoe tables, so in a lot of ways they would also be like integral to meal prep and like eating food. Like the canoe is amazing, and has a very long history in that region. The way canoes are created modern day still have elements that go way back to birch bark canoes by the indigenous people, the Anishinaabe. And so it is really cool to see like how it works and that like this same style has worked for thousands of years and is still used today. So yeah, I have a pretty deep relationship with canoes. Rafts, I have a much closer relationship with them now after this summer, but there's just something about the canoe in its essence. It is old. And I think that is just so cool.
So what I'm hearing is that you need to get into a dory instead of a raft.
Honestly, I think I would thrive in a dory. I'd be very afraid though, like bumping it on rocks, because like I don't want to bump your nice boat on anything. Rafts are wonderful. There's like nothing natural on them. It drives me nuts.
There's nothing natural.
This is plastic.
What are you talking about? There's those 3D frames that have one piece of plywood on them.
That's fair. Yeah, that's fair. The plywood. I guess all the sand that's just everywhere. My big blue raft.
Who's been like your favorite participant that you've ever had? And like,
were
they your favorite?
Ooh.
And it can just be the first one that comes to mind too.
I feel like there's so many. Goodness. Yeah, in my mind, like all these experiences are like flashing into my brain right now. I'm like, oh my God. Like how could I possibly choose a favorite? There was a group I guided in 2019 who were just absolutely the strongest, toughest, most resilient group I've ever had. They're all so close to my heart still. They have to take the cake for favorite or most memorable just because circumstances of our experience was so hard and they all just like rocked through it with such grace and kindness and care for one another. It just was really inspiring and one of those moments where like you never hope to be in a situation that tough, but that group, very afraid though, of like bumping it on rocks, because like you don't want to bump your nice boat on anything. The rafts are wonderful. There's like nothing natural on them. It drives me nuts.
There's nothing natural.
This is plastic.
What are you talking about? There's those 3D frames that have one piece of plywood on them.
That's fair. The plywood. I guess all the sand that's just everywhere. My big blue raft.
What value do you see for the participants, the students, the clients that come through?
I'm going to talk about old women. My favorite demographic to guide. Kids are phenomenal, but I think I once had the privilege of guiding a Women in the Wilderness trip in the Boundary Waters. And it was this really delightful group of women who didn't know each other before the trip and then all came together for this trip. And I'll be damned, it rained like the whole time. Like 36 hours of straight rain. And I just was like, I was not having it. They were not having it. But it was really sweet to see this group of women, many of whom were there with this like, my husband told me I could never do this, so I'm going to do it to prove him wrong kind of attitude. Was just like really delightful. And they all did it because they're all badasses, like the wilderness is for everyone. Everyone can find something out there. Yeah, it was just really fun for them to like get the opportunity to connect in a deeper way and to not really realize that they were going to connect in a deeper way. I think a lot of them just experienced it or expected it rather to be like, oh, we're going to go out, we're going to canoe, we're going to do some things, it's going to be real nice, and take them on a little hike and to like teach them how to do all the things themselves. That's always my goal as a guide, is to impart the knowledge and the ability so people can come back out without the need of a guide. It was just really special with that group specifically to see them be like, yeah, I can do this. And I think a couple of them have gone back without needing a guide and have like taken their friends and family out. And that to me is the best. Like, they're out there doing it. Heck yeah.
That's hilariously awesome. Where they're just like, we're going to stick it to our husbands because we can do it. And then they come out and they're like, oh yeah, this is actually awesome. And like that bonding is always super cool to see.
Yeah, that sensation of for them where it's like, I've been told my whole life I can't or I shouldn't do this. And oh my God, I could do it all along. So now I need to catch up and do more because what else can I do? I think is really the essence of guiding anyone. That's always what I hope they take away is like, I can do this and I should do this if I want to.
So how many companies have you worked for? Guiding and instructing or?
Yeah, I think officially it would be 4. The Boundary Waters, I worked for 2 different spots, and then I had some partnership stuff with a few other programs. And then Deer Hill Expeditions is the other major organization that I've guided for.
So as someone who's like been doing this for at least a minute, what is your take on where the industry is today? We've gone through a COVID spike, and now there's the COVID slump.
I'll also elaborate. I have a bachelor's degree in natural resources, recreation, and tourism. So this is like very much my life and my world. I see a distressing trend across the industry of lower participation numbers, especially within youth. This is something that's pretty prevalent and evident in a lot of the major organizations. And so I think what's going on in the industry is perhaps a lot of things. We look at students who maybe are not as enticed by those sendy trips, as I was talking about earlier. There seems to be more clear participation in experiences closer to home, in local state parks and city parks and things that are like accessible to them, and less participation in, big expedition type experiences that used to be like really synonymous with outdoor education. I think following the pandemic, the industry was on the rise. There was just like, you couldn't get enough programming. You couldn't get enough students, classes, programs, things were fully booked. And now it's tentative if some programs are even going to run. So as for that, I'm not sure what's happening there and why participation is on the decrease. But I do think for people who have chosen to be in this industry, it's a tough industry to be in. Every day we interact with tourism, hospitality, and outdoor recreation. But it's just one of those things that often does not provide what would be traditionally considered a good benefited job. For people working in this industry, it's hard to continue doing the gig economy thing where you have like 4 jobs and it's seasonal and you're getting burnt out and you're having these tough experiences and you're giving your whole soul to these groups and then turning around and not having enough money to take care of a sprained ankle after your trip. I see that too as impacting a part of this economy is, like when the guides and when the staff are starting to get fatigued and tired, there isn't as much stoke and excitement around these industries. In a perfect world, like We would have universal health care, uh, and other things, other social amenities that would help reduce the stress of needing a good benefited job to stay within the outdoor tourism recreation industry. And that's tough. I think, in terms of employee wise, finding ways to bring benefits more than just like healthcare and 401bs, 401ks, finding ways to keep people invested in it long term so that they don't get burnt out, because it is a very easy industry to get burnt out in. You put so much in and sometimes you don't get a lot back out.
This is a question I should ask sooner. But what made you leave the Boundary Waters and come back to Colorado?
I say affectionately, I was getting a little Boundary Waters burnt out. I've been working for a nonprofit that we're just focusing and emphasizing on the Boundary Waters all day, every day. And, this topic would come up really frequently between, like, do we bring in other industry into this small town to provide good, stable, benefited jobs? Or, do we just continue with the tourism economy that we have now and kind of stay in the status quo? Personally, neither of those things was like an awesome option. I felt like I wanted to go out and broaden my horizons and see what raft guiding was like. How is that different from canoeing? How is that landscape or the many landscapes that you can raft in different from what I had been doing for like 6 or 7 summer seasons? I was tired and I wanted to move on and see what other miracles are here, especially in the United States. We have such a diverse landscape. Like the fact that some place like the Boundary Waters and places like the Green River and Desolation Canyon exist on our same territory, quote unquote, is truly a phenomenal and miraculous thing, that within this same United States, like there's so much diversity in our geography. So I was curious, what else is out there?
So you talked about like keep things as the same or bring in other industry. If you were crowned monarch of the outdoor ed world or outdoor recreation world, like, and we'll start specific with the Boundary Waters, like what would be your third option that you would make that feels not mediocre or mildly crappy?
Finding ways to have upward mobility. So like maybe once you're done guiding, there's a way within your same outfitter or industry to like move into managerial roles or whatever it might be. Like a clear way to do that would be really cool. I think reframing the way in which we perceive the hospitality, tourism, and recreation industry is the top thing I want. I don't think I've ever talked to anyone who's ever really taken this industry as like a serious, viable, long-term career option. I tell people like, I have a degree in tourism and I'm a wilderness guide. And there's always a little bit of that, like, oh, that's so good of you doing what you love, and regardless of how much it pays, that kind of idea of like, it's not a serious industry, despite it bringing in a serious amount of GDP in this country, is like really frustrating. I'd love to reframe everybody's perception of tourism and, change it from this kind of like, college aged druggy kid job to like a serious profession in joy, because that's what it is. When people take trips, like they want to go have fun. It's the profession of leisure and recreation and not just goofing off. Like it's a serious industry, darn it. That's what I want to change, is people's ideas of it.
Changing the perspective, and that's your solution as far as like, you think that would also then increase enrollment and like help revitalize the industry as a whole, or do you think that there's something else that also needs to be in play too?
Benefits is really key, but I do think if students see like, oh, there's this whole world of like outdoor recreation that's a viable, livable career option, I could see that being more of an incentive to get involved at a younger age and then to like continue up into it. in the same way that, you know, like kids as children are like, I want to be a doctor, I want to be a police officer, I want to go into politics. You know, those things are framed as like really prestigious, important institutions. And so I do think like if a child is like, I want to be a raft guide, like if a child were to say that right now, they'd be like, yeah, sure, kid, like have fun. If there was more prestige associated with the industry as a whole, I do feel like that could impact how people want to get invested in it, because it's everywhere. Tourism
is everywhere all the time, 365. Shall we go into the rapid fire then?
Yeah, let's do it. Rapid fire.
Okay, one favorite meal on trail.
Pancakes. And you knew that was coming too.
I did. Is it plain pancakes or a specific one with fruit?
I usually make some sort of like fruit syrup thing. In Minnesota, we'd pick wild blueberries and raspberries and we'd like make wild fruit syrups for our pancakes. I'm a real fruit and Nutella kind of pancake person.
What is the one thing that you always bring on a trip, luxury item?
A really nice camp pillow. Like I don't bring a sleeping pad, I just like need a really nice pillow.
I just need a really nice pillow.
That's it. That's my need.
A favorite place that you have visited?
Argo Lake in the Quetico.
Do you have any places that you're trying to go at this point, planning a trip for?
Not at this moment. I'm pretty wrapped up in the ski industry world now. I haven't had any time to think about where to go. Maybe one day I'd love to go visit some Asian countries and kind of see what the flora and fauna is there, because I haven't spent much time in tropical regions.
Cool regions. And best natural motivator for getting students to do a task.
I think the best motivator is often like little treats and food, and, you know, not in that like weird gatekeepy way, but in the like, if we do this thing, I have candy, you know, like all supplemental little treats instead of like lunch.
Oh, that is not what I was thinking. I thought you were going to be like bug hour.
Yeah, I guess. I mean, that is an excellent motivator, but like if you haven't finished the dishes, like you can't, and like the bugs are out, the incentive is gone, you know, like the kids are either gonna like sit there and suffer and be like, these bugs are awful. And I'm also standing there like, yep, I'm right there with you. You know, like the goal is to get stuff done before the bugs come out, but that doesn't always happen.
It's like in the summertime where it's like, okay, we got 20 minutes before that line of shade is now past us and we're just roasting.
Yep.
Nobody moves any faster. I'm just like, oh, God, come on.
In fact, they probably move slower because they're hot and they're having a bad
time.
time.
Yeah, once the sun comes out. Anything else you want to add?
Sand is still hard and awful, but like I said, Deer Hill and guiding the desert Southwest was such an eye-opener. And I'm glad that there is such a robust industry, especially in Colorado and in this region, to be able to accommodate exploring and broadening your horizons as an outdoor industry professional. I think that's like really cool.
Well, Maddie, thank you for joining me on Doing the Thing. Hope you have a great ski season and can start ripping lines with some 20 bamboo poles.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. That's on my docket for maybe next week. Yeah. Perfect. Consider the thing done. Thanks, Scott.